In Chapter 2, we talked about the difference between dependent clauses and independent clauses, and I explained that that information and your ability to discern between the two of those is really important, especially in punctuation. So we're going to jump now to talking about colons and semicolons. Chapter 3 starts on page 3, because that's one of the quickest ways for you to be able to recognize how important that distinction is. If I had to sum it all up for you, and if I just had a couple of minutes to talk to you about colons and semicolons, I'd give you this chart right here. And I'd tell you that if you're going to use a semicolon, remember to have an independent clause on both sides. If you want to use a colon, make sure you have an independent clause on the front side, but that it doesn't really matter what comes after a colon. And that's a pretty big distinction. And as you can see, it's really important for you to be able to know an independent clause when you see one, or you are very likely to make mistakes using semicolons and colons. So let's go back and talk about the semicolon first. If we know that we're supposed to separate two independent clauses, we can avoid making mistakes like this one. If someone might write, "We have much to accomplish." Well, that's an independent clause, no problem. But "more than we realize" is not an independent clause. So we can't attach those two groups of words with just a semicolon. What we have here, in fact, is a pronoun followed by a clause comparison, an adverb clause, with its own subject and verb. But we don't have an independent clause. We don't have a clause that can stand alone. So our semicolon will not work here. What we need to do instead to make the semicolon work, if in fact that's what we want to do, is make this a clause on the other side. So now we have two independent clauses. Each of those groups of words could stand alone as a sentence. Our semicolon's okay. Another way to think about it is that a semicolon is really very much like a period when you're talking about punctuating between clauses. Now we're going to look at lists in a minute. That's a different scenario. But when we're talking about punctuating between clauses, the same way you decide whether to put a period or not, if a period will work, a semicolon should work. Now that doesn't mean you want to use a semicolon all over the place. Every time you maybe you're tired of using periods, so you start using semicolons instead. That's not the idea. The semicolon shows that these two sentences are more closely related than other sentences in the same document or paragraph or email or whatever it is you're writing at the time. So if you overuse them, then you lose that effect. Then the reader can't tell what's important, which ideas matter to each other more than other ideas matter to each other in the paragraph. So use them sparingly. To draw two ideas together to help the reader see connections, because we're always trying to help the reader follow our logic. Why is this sentence here in the paragraph? What does it have to do with the sentence before it? And just by virtue of your using a semicolon instead of a period, you're telling the reader these two ideas are very closely related. Pay attention to how they're closely related. Here's another example. We have much to accomplish. Well, that's an independent clause, as we noted up here and here. Here comes another independent clause. We also have much to gain. And however is a conjunctive adverb, it does not affect the status of that clause. If that clause is independent without it, it's still independent with the conjunctive adverb. So here we have two independent clauses joined by a comma. And as we will learn in our comma chapters, actually there are two of them, we can't use a comma to hold together two independent clauses. Instead, we need something stronger, and we'll look at actually several different ways we might repunctuate that. But for the sake of this conversation about semicolons, we'll just say that it would be better with a semicolon. Two independent clauses joined together with a semicolon. Just as you could put a period, you can put a semicolon. All right, so what about, some of you are saying to yourself, but Nancy, what about lists? Okay. That if you're dealing with a list, and even one of the items in the list has internal commas, then you might want to, probably will want to use a semicolon to show the larger break between the items. Okay, let's look at an example. So the speakers were Jane Doe, president of Cyber Pro Corporation. That is one item in my list. Person's name, her title. Here's another item in my list, Jim Smith and his title. And here's a third item in my list, John Doe and his title. So I have commas in each of the 3 items in my list. Therefore, I go up to a semicolon between the list just to help the reader follow the bigger break, to say, oh, this is a new item coming up now. So even if only one of those had commas, we would have been obliged to you might say, up the ante on the punctuation between the actual items in the list. Or after a while, it would have been hard for a reader to tell which positions went with which person. And you'll notice that we also use it in front of the and here. If you're using semicolons to separate the items in your list, you do it every time, consistently, even the one before the and. Okay, so that's semicolons. So 2 good uses for the semicolon between independent clauses and in a list when the items themselves have internal commas. That's it. Colons. Well, as we said, we're less concerned with colons about what comes on the other side, the far side, if you will. But we do care an awful lot about what comes on the front side, and that's where people get in trouble. They'll say things like, here we go, this example right here on the page. Those designated teacher of the year in District 1 included, well, that's the verb, and the direct objects are over here. That's not okay. The entire syntax or structure of the sentence needs to be on the same side of the colon, needs to be on the front. So I might have said instead, 3 people were designated teacher of the year in District 1. You can even hear my voice drop. Listen to the difference between those designated teacher of the year in District 1 included, and you can hear my voice hasn't dropped because I'm in the middle of the sentence. But down here, 3 people were designated teacher of the year in District 1. Colon. So we're looking for that independent clause in front of the colon. Let's look at another example. Very common to see this. The winners were colon, right? In designing my course, we had a page, marketing page, and the marketing developers said on that page, get it right, courses will offer you colon. And I'm like, nope, can't keep that colon there. We've got to either finish the sentence or take out the colon. But people are so uncomfortable having nothing after a colon in front of any kind of list, whether it's internal in a paragraph or it's a vertical list. People don't like to leave that moment right before the list unadorned with some sort of punctuation. But it's okay. If you wanted to keep the constructions that we had up here at the top, all we really had to do was take out the colon. Neither of those sentences had to have a colon to say what they want to say. The same down here, what we've done is we've changed the structure of the sentence so that we can keep the colon, right? But neither of these is wrong. Now that we've taken out these colons, these sentences are just fine. They just weren't okay when we had the colon and the information in front of the colon was incomplete. Okay. So remember down here in this chart, this picture I drew for you, we said that a semicolon has to have 2 independent clauses. But we also noted that an independent clause can be on either side of a colon. So how are you going to know which is the better choice? When you finally just say, okay, I've got an independent clause, I've got an independent clause, I can use a colon or a semicolon. How do you know which one to use? Here's what you want to think about. The semicolon just shows that these 2 ideas are closely related. But with a colon, there's a slightly different relationship. For example, when I said here, 3 teachers were winners, what are you dying to know? Who they were, right? If you get that answer on the other side of the colon, or excuse me, I should say if you get that answer on the other in the next chunk of words, because we haven't decided to use a colon yet, then that's a good place to use a colon, because the colon sort of says, here it is, ta-da! Or I'm occasionally, I'm not much of a drummer, but sort of like ba-dum-bump, right? Ba-dum-bump. There we go. So think about the colon as suggesting that, and I'm going to tell you what I just hinted at, right? What is the sentence in front of the colon begging you to tell the world, right, in your document? So look at these 2 sentences. If I say John has a serious problem, notice both of these start with John has a serious problem. What are you dying to know if I say John has a serious problem? You want to know what his problem is. Which of these 2 sentences tells you the problem? He does not know how to relax, right? Not we hope to help him. That is a closely related sentence, but it doesn't tell you the problem. We get to the end of this sentence and we still don't know what the problem is. So once we've determined that we had an independent clause on both sides of this punctuation, and we know that grammatically we could have used a colon or a semicolon, then the next thing you have to decide is what's going on. What do those ideas tell us? And if the second independent clause tells me the answer to the question that I've left the reader dying to know, then I should use a colon. And that's why we've used a colon here in the second pair of independent clauses. And then the last thing we do with the colon, typically, and you'll see this later when we talk about commas, but typically when we have a quote, we have a little speech tag like John said, comma, or Kenesha noted, comma, or Bailey commented, comma. Those are called speech tags. But sometimes we have something more before a quotation, something more elaborate that is itself a complete sentence. As in this example, the chairman of the board stood up to make himself more visible to the cameras. And now I'm going to give you the quote that he said, or she, whoever the chairman is, or himself, her, he. Now I'm going to tell you what that person said, which is also an independent clause. So we have an independent clause leading into a quote, which is itself an independent clause. That's a perfect time for the colon before the quote. So put another way, you may have a colon before a quotation, you may have a comma before a quotation, or you may have nothing before a quotation, but you will not have a semicolon in front of a quotation. It's not going to happen. Okay, that's it. That wasn't a really hard, long chapter, but really important ideas. And so I'm asking you next to complete the quiz on semicolons and colons. And if you don't do well on the quiz, you might want to backtrack and come back and watch this video again. But if you're ready to move on, then you'll complete the practice exercise on semicolons and colons on page 5. And then you'll watch a video of me going over that practice exercise to see how you did.